The morning light crept slowly over the plantation, stretching across the cabins and fields like a grey veil trying to wake a reluctant world. Jonas worked alone near the smokehouse, his breath steady and controlled as he lifted barrel after barrel of cured pork. Each container weighed enough to make an average labourer falter, yet Jonas moved them with a deliberate ease born from years of relentless toil. His strength was the kind that made men whisper, but Jonas never drew attention to it. He kept his focus low, watching his broad hands grip the salted wood, hoping the quiet repetition of his work would shield him from the overseer's eyes. The air around him carried the scent of smoked meat mingled with the dark, earthy breath of the cypress swamp beyond the fields. That swamp was a boundary of sorts, a place the enslaved looked toward with both fear and longing. It promised danger, but also escape, and Jonas had always felt its presence like a silent witness lingering just past the crops. He wiped his brow, feeling the familiar ache in his back, an ache he ignored the way one ignores a shadow that has walked beside them for years. Overseer Brandt stood near the veranda of the plantation house, arms folded, his expression tinged with the same suspicion he wore every day. To Brandt, Jonas's size was a problem waiting to erupt, a threat he feared but would never admit aloud. The overseer's gaze followed Jonas the way a hunter watches an animal it can't decide whether to respect or fear. Jonas knew that look well. It had chased him across every task he'd been given, pressed against him like a weight heavier than any barrel. Among the enslaved, people often wondered why someone built like Jonas didn't push back, didn't break free of his chains. But Jonas had learned long ago that survival depended on silence just as much as strength. Words could turn into weapons against him, and displays of power only fed the overseer's fear. He lifted the final barrel into place, letting out a long, quiet breath before turning to face Brandt's barked command. "Clean yourself up and get to the front grounds," the overseer snapped. "Governor's arriving for inspection." Jonas nodded once, his eyes lowered, the familiar knot of dread tightening in his stomach at the mention of the governor's name. By mid-morning, the enslaved community stood in a long line facing the plantation house, their backs rigid, hands clasped or held still at their sides. Jonas positioned himself at the far end, towering over everyone despite his effort to shrink into the background. Eyes darted toward him, some filled with worry, some with curiosity, others with that haunting mixture of admiration and disbelief. An elderly woman named Sarah stood near him, her face weathered but alert. She whispered without turning her head, "Governor Vale himself. God help us all." Jonas didn't answer. The stories about Thaddeus Vale drifted through every plantation he visited like smoke, choking, lingering, impossible to ignore. Each year he arrived to remind people of the power he wielded, and each year he left behind new scars, new broken families, new proof that cruelty was a luxury he indulged freely. Jonas stared at the dust beneath his feet as the rhythmic clatter of hooves and carriage wheels grew louder. Guests appeared first, wealthy planters, their wives in pale dresses, men smug with entitlement. And then the governor stepped down, his polished boots gleaming as though the earth itself had no right to stain them. Governor Vale was not an imposing man in size, but he carried himself with the exaggerated presence of someone intoxicated by authority. His cheeks were flushed, his posture rigid, his smile a sharp line that never reached his eyes. He paced down the row of enslaved people with calculated leisure, occasionally stopping to make mocking remarks that drew forced laughter from his companions. When he reached Jonas, he paused, his expression shifting into something resembling fascination mixed with challenge. "What have we here?" he murmured. Jonas kept his gaze low, but Vale's command cracked through the silence like a whip. "Look at me." Jonas lifted his eyes just long enough to obey, careful not to meet the governor's stare too boldly. Vale circled him like a man judging livestock, as if Jonas's humanity were merely an inconvenient assumption. "Remarkable size," the governor observed. "Tell me, how much can you lift?" Jonas answered quietly, "Whatever's required, sir." Vale laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that told Jonas more trouble was coming. The governor then turned to the guests, raising his voice as if announcing entertainment at a festival. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've just discovered sport for the afternoon." A wave of uneasy murmurs passed through the assembled crowd. Jonas felt Sarah stiffen beside him, her breath catching as if she'd been struck. Vale continued, "Back home, we hunt large creatures for sport, to test their endurance, to see whether their size is matched by wits." He gestured to Jonas as one might gesture toward a bull in an arena. "This one will run through the swamp and we'll see how well he survives." The words fell heavy in the air, shocking in their boldness, yet spoken with the ease of a man suggesting a stroll after dinner. Jonas kept his breathing steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Brant stepped forward, voice tinged with nervous eagerness. "Governor, that swamp isn't safe. Quicksand, snakes—" "Exactly," Vale interrupted with a grin. "Danger makes it worthwhile." Before Jonas could process the command, hands seized his arms, stripping the knife from his belt, pulling off his shoes, preparing him like one prepares an animal for release. The governor's guests mounted their horses, excitement glittering in their eyes. Vale lifted his rifle, pointed toward the swamp, and called out with chilling enthusiasm, "Run, boy! Let's test what you're truly made of!" Jonas plunged into the swamp before he even realized he was running, his bare feet striking wet earth that sucked at his soles like hungry hands. The cypress trees rose around him in towering clusters, their long moss-draped limbs swaying like silent watchers. The deeper he pushed, the more the plantation's ordered world dissolved behind him, swallowed by the tangled wilderness that smelled of life, decay, and secrets older than the estate itself. Branches whipped against his arms, leaving thin welts, but he barely noticed. Behind him, the hounds had already erupted into furious barking, their handlers shouting as they released them into the trees. Jonas forced himself to breathe steadily, fighting the instinct to run blind. He needed clarity, not panic. Old Man Harlan's voice surfaced in his memory, quiet, patient, always carrying the weight of wisdom earned in silence. "The swamp isn't chaos," the old man had once said. "It has rules if you know where to look." Jonas slowed just enough to study the moss, the water, the angle of roots beneath the surface. Even fear, sharp as it was, could not bury Harlan's lessons. He spotted the faint sign of a hidden path, a subtle ripple in the water's surface, barely visible unless one knew the trick of seeing it. The moss hung slightly thicker to his right, just as Harlan had described. Jonas shifted direction, slipping onto the submerged trail that lay firm beneath the mud. His breath eased. The dogs' voices grew sharper, clearer, echoing across the cypress forest as they entered the swamp's edge. Jonas moved quickly but not carelessly, stepping from one solid patch to another, letting the land guide him as if it remembered the footsteps of those who had passed before him. Harlan had spoken of the Chitimacha paths, trails woven through the swamp, by people who understood its moods long before plantations carved the land into misery. Jonas felt as though he were walking on their borrowed wisdom, trusting a map written by nature rather than man. Behind him, he heard Vale shouting commands, his voice cutting through the trees, angry and triumphant. The man wanted a spectacle, and Jonas intended to deny him one. Hours dragged on as Jonas pushed deeper into the swamp. The canopy overhead tangled so thickly that sunlight filtered through in thin, trembling beams, giving the world an eerie half-light that made time difficult to measure. His legs burned from exertion, his lungs tightening with every stride, but he kept moving. Occasionally, the hunting party's noise grew louder, pressing fear into his spine, but then it would fade, proving he'd chosen his path well. Once, he climbed halfway up a leaning cypress trunk to rest and watch. Vale's party rode in the wrong direction, confused and frustrated. Jonas allowed himself the smallest breath of satisfaction. Not joy, not triumph, just survival. He descended quietly and moved on, careful never to leave an obvious trail. When he reached a marshy clearing, he stopped short. The water here shone strangely still, almost beautiful, a smoothness that belied its danger. This was the place Harlan had warned him about, the hungry hollow, where the ground pretended to hold but would swallow a man whole without mercy. Jonas tested the edge with one foot, feeling the subtle give of the earth. Harlan had said the stable spots revealed themselves through the reeds, through the direction the water pulled, through differences so small most men never learned to notice them. Jonas crouched, studying every detail, letting the old man's memory guide him. Then he began crossing, stepping lightly, shifting his weight just so, moving from solid patch to solid patch. Halfway through the mire, He heard the first crashing sound of hooves behind him. Vale's riders had found the clearing. "There!" a voice shouted. Jonas kept moving. He dared not look back. Water splashed violently as Vale's horse entered the marsh, the governor shouting orders, as if commanding the swamp itself to bend to his will. Jonas reached the far side and slipped into the palmetto thicket, hiding just long enough to watch the inevitable unfold. Vale, too proud to observe the land, rode straight into the hollow. The governor's horse lurched, its front legs plunging into the sinking mud. A brutal scream tore from the animal's throat as it clawed at the surface. Desperate for footing, Vale pitched forward, grabbing the reins in panic. The horse managed to wrench itself backward toward firmer ground, but Vale slid from the saddle, landing in the mire with a sickening slurp. Mud climbed his legs, pulling him downward as he thrashed. His men shouted warnings, but none dared approach the unstable ground. Jonas exhaled slowly. This moment, the governor, trapped, helpless, terrified, could have been freedom. He could disappear deeper into the swamp, save himself, and let the swamp finish what it had begun. But the faces of the enslaved flashed in his mind. Sarah, the children, the men and women who would bear the punishment if Vale died here. His survival could mean their suffering. Jonas stepped out from the palmetto shadows, heart heavy but resolute. Jonas stepped carefully back onto the unstable marsh path he had just crossed, his every movement deliberate, remembering precisely where the safe pockets of ground lay hidden beneath the deceptively smooth surface. Vale thrashed harder as Jonas approached, panic widening the governor's eyes. He looked nothing like the arrogant official who had mocked Jonas hours earlier. He now resembled any man confronted with the unforgiving truth of nature. "Stop moving," Jonas called out, his voice steady. "You'll sink faster." Vale's frantic motions froze, his breath sharp and ragged. Jonas extended an arm toward him, planting his own feet firmly on a stable root beneath the mud. "Take my hand," he instructed. Vale hesitated, his pride fighting the necessity of accepting help from the man he had hunted for sport. But survival outweighed dignity. Slowly, Vale reached out. Jonas tightened his grip and pulled with controlled strength, lifting Vale inch by inch until the governor broke free from the swamp's clutch with a wet, sucking gasp. Jonas steadied him on solid ground before stepping back, lowering his gaze as Vale tried to catch his breath, soaked, humiliated, and vibrating with unspoken fury. The riders sat rigid on their horses, stunned by the reversal they had just witnessed. None spoke. Their expressions betrayed a discomfort deeper than shock. They had seen the fragile line between predator and prey snap in an instant. Vale wiped the mud from his face with trembling hands, his breaths coming in shallow bursts. Instead of gratitude, his eyes burned with something far darker, humiliation twisted into resentment. He stared at Jonas as though the man had committed an offense simply by allowing him to live. "Get him back to the plantation," Vale said through clenched teeth. The command was small but venomous. His voice trembled with controlled rage. Two riders dismounted and seized Jonas by the arms, tying a rope loosely around his wrists before leading him back through the swamp. Jonas did not resist. He saved a man who would never acknowledge his humanity, yet he had done what he believed necessary to prevent the suffering of those he cared about. Still, as he walked behind the horses, exhaustion pooling in his limbs, Jonas sensed the weight of something unfinished. The swamp had witnessed the truth, but the world outside it had not. When they reached the plantation, nothing felt the same. The enslaved who glimpsed Jonas from their cabins wore expressions too careful, too guarded. His mud-covered clothes and bruised skin told a story before words could. The guests who had gathered earlier now clustered near the veranda, whispering with discomfort over the governor's bedraggled state. Vale disappeared into the main house, surrounded by attendants who fussed over him, all pretending not to notice the way he staggered slightly as he walked. Jonas stood in the yard, surrounded by overseers, until Brant approached, his face tight with restrained resentment. "Get to your quarters," Brant ordered brusquely. "No talking, no wandering." Jonas nodded once, limping toward the small cabin he shared. His ankle throbbed in protest, each step reminding him how close he had come to collapse. Inside the cabin, the air was still and dim. Jonas lowered himself onto his pallet, pressing his palms to his eyes. He felt no triumph, no relief, only a deep unease settling in his bones. Vale had not thanked him. He had not acknowledged Jonas's choice. And a man like Vale never forgot humiliation. Night settled slowly, dragging unease with it. Jonas lay awake long after the other men returned from the fields, pretending to sleep as they whispered about what they had heard. The hunt gone wrong, the governor's fall, the strange rumor that Jonas had pulled Vale from the swamp's jaws. Their voices held awe, fear and dread in equal measure. Jonas knew what Vale must be feeling. Not gratitude, not humility. Pride wounded is more dangerous than anger. As the household lights dimmed outside, Jonas listened to the rhythm of footsteps from the main house. The steps were heavy and restless, pacing back and forth across the wooden floorboards above the kitchen hall. Vale was awake. He was thinking, planning. Jonas wrapped his arms around himself, feeling the cold dread seep deeper. He had done the merciful thing, but mercy given to a cruel man often becomes another weapon he will sharpen. Jonas watched the moon through the narrow cabin window, its pale glow tracing silver lines across the yard. He feared dawn more than he feared the swamp. Morning came too soon, harsh and unforgiving. Brant kicked open the cabin door with unnecessary force. "Doctor needs help in the storage room," he barked. Jonas forced himself up, every muscle protesting. He followed Brant into the main house, entering through the back hall where the plantation doctor sorted bottles and salves on overcrowded shelves. The air was thick with the smell of camphor and bitter herbs. "Hold these," Dr. Carrill said without looking at Jonas, handing him 2 crates of glass jars. Jonas lifted them easily, but he stood rigid when voices drifted from the adjoining room. Governor Vale's study. The doctor's voice, calm but firm, reached through the wall. "You're not well, Thaddeus. Yesterday's episode was a warning. Your heart cannot endure excitement or strain." Jonas stood absolutely still, listening to every word. Vale's voice replied, tense and defensive. "I'm fine." It was the swamp. The heat. "It was your heart," Dr. Carrill corrected quietly. "If you continue at this pace, you may not survive the next incident." Jonas's heartbeat quickened. Vale, weakened, vulnerable. The truth settled in Jonas's chest like a stone. The governor's fury was not the only threat looming. His failing strength was another fuel for his recklessness. Jonas set the crates down quietly as Dr. Carrill finished speaking in the next room. Through the wall he heard Vale pacing, the board creaking beneath his boots. The governor's voice came low, shaken, stripped of its usual bluster. "How long before this condition becomes fatal?" Carrill hesitated, his tone gentler than Jonas had ever heard it. "That depends on how you live, Thaddeus. Avoid stress, avoid exertion, no more hunts, no more confrontations. If you don't restrain yourself, months, maybe less." Silence followed, heavy and brittle. Jonas felt the weight of those words press through the wall and into his own bones. Vale was afraid, a truth Jonas had never imagined possible. Moments later, the study door opened, footsteps receding down the hall, leaving only the doctor muttering softly to himself as he mixed powders. Jonas remained still, absorbing what he had learned. Vale's body was failing him. The powerful man who strutted and thundered through the plantation was now carrying his own mortality like a hidden wound. But fear in the hands of a cruel man turns sharp, not soft. Jonas knew this revelation would not lead to mercy, only more desperation. When Jonas stepped out into the hallway, he almost collided with Evelyn Vale. The governor's wife stood poised and composed, her pale blue dress muted by the dim light. She studied Jonas with a calm intensity that unsettled him more than shouts ever had. "You're the one who pulled my husband from the marsh," she said, not questioning, but confirming. Jonas lowered his gaze. "Yes, ma'am." "Look at me," she said softly. Jonas obeyed. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind, carrying a different kind of weight, a quiet intelligence shaped by years of enduring a man like Thaddeus Vale. "You saved his life yesterday," she said. "I thank you for that." Jonas swallowed, uncertain how to respond. Gratitude from someone of her world felt dangerous. She reached into a pocket and withdrew a silver locket, small and delicate. "Take this." Jonas hesitated. Gifts from people in her position always came with consequences. But she pressed it into his hand, her voice lowering. "It is not just thanks, it is acknowledgement." A sign that what you did was seen. Her gaze flickered down the hall as if measuring unwelcome ears. There may come a time when your courage is remembered. Jonas tucked the locket beneath his shirt, feeling its unfamiliar weight against his skin. For a brief moment, a flicker of hope touched him. Not hope for freedom, but hope for recognition of his humanity. The notion passed as quickly as it came. He left the house, returning to his tasks, but the day moved strangely. Overseers barked orders with tense voices. Whispers traveled between cabins faster than work songs. Something had shifted in the air. By evening, it was as though the entire plantation held its breath. Jonas sat near his cabin as the sun dipped low, the sky turning purple. His fingers pressed lightly against the locket through his shirt. A tremor of unease ran through him. Then he heard it. Footsteps, multiple sets, slow, deliberate, approaching. The hair rose on the back of his neck as Governor Vale emerged with Brant and two overseers flanking him like guards. The governor's face was tight, drained of color, his eyes burning with humiliation, masked as righteousness. "Stand!" Vale commanded. Jonas rose, bracing. The governor stepped closer, the lantern light casting long, distorted shadows across his mud-spattered boots. "Last night," he began, his voice trembling, "my guests laughed behind their hands. They laughed because I, a governor, had to be rescued by property." The word struck like a blow. Vale's chest heaved with restrained rage. "Do you understand the insult? They mocked my authority in my own home." His voice grew sharper, louder. "So hear this. At dawn, there will be another hunt. A final one. No mercy, no humiliation, only an ending." The enslaved gathered nearby were frozen, their fear palpable. Sarah let out a soft gasp before covering her mouth. Jonas held still, muscles tight, the locket cold against his chest. Vale's lips curled into a bitter smile. "When we find you tomorrow, it will end with a body." Then, as though a curtain had dropped, Vale turned away, signaling his men to disperse. The overseers barked orders, pushing everyone back toward their cabins. Jonas stood alone in the yard, the night air pressing heavy on his shoulders. His mercy had become his sentence. Back inside the cabin, Jonas sat on the floor, staring at the locket in his palm. The firelight flickered across its silver surface, making it glow like a thing alive. Evelyn's words whispered through his memory, though their meaning now twisted painfully. "There may come a time when your courage is remembered." He had saved a man who would rather kill him than admit dependence on him. And by dawn, Jonas would either die in the swamp or escape so deeply that he would never see the people he cared for again, leaving them vulnerable to Vale's wrath. He closed his fist around the locket, his breath trembling. Outside, the murmur of frightened whispers drifted between cabins. Children cried softly. Every heart carried the weight of what tomorrow meant. Jonas looked out the small window toward the rising moon. The swamp lay beyond the fields, dark and unknowable, yet the only place offering a sliver of possibility. He inhaled deeply. Tomorrow would not be a repetition of the first hunt. Tomorrow he could no longer run blindly. He had to do more than survive. He had to find a way to break Vale's power. Dawn arrived like a warning, bleeding pale yellow across the plantation yard, as Jonas was marched out between two overseers. His wrists were unbound, but the grip on his arms left no question about his captivity. 6 riders gathered near the swamp's border, their horses restless, snorting clouds into the morning air. Dogs strained against their handlers, barking with wild impatience. The enslaved people were locked inside their cabins, but Jonas could feel eyes watching through gaps between boards, silent prayers following him to the tree line. Governor Vale emerged last. He looked weaker than the day before, his skin sallow, his movement stiff. But his eyes, those eyes, still burned with the feverish resolve of a man intent on reclaiming his pride through violence. "Bring him forward," Vale called. Jonas stepped toward the swamp, the air heavy with the scent of mud and decay. A guest lifted the hunting horn. The long, trembling note cut through the morning, signaling the beginning of something far darker than sport. Jonas ran. He ran not for glory, not for hope, but because his life, and the lives of others, rested in what he could do with the time that horn had given him. He plunged into the dense green world of the swamp, pushing past branches that clawed at his arms, quicksand patches, fallen logs, pools of murky water. He navigated them all with the memory of old Harlan's teachings etched into his bones. But this time, the hunt felt different. It wasn't fear that drove him. It was a cold, sharp clarity. He moved deeper into territory far beyond the paths he knew. The land changed. Water deepened, shadows thickened. But he kept going. Smoke began to rise behind him. Vale had ordered fires to flush him out. The heat rolled through the swamp in angry waves, forcing animals to bolt from their hiding places. Jonas waded through knee-high water, every step a battle against exhaustion. His ankle throbbed with each movement, reminding him of yesterday's escape. Still, he pressed forward until he stumbled onto something unexpected, a cluster of makeshift shelters elevated on stilts over a patch of higher ground. Jonas froze, breath short. Someone lived here. This was no hunter's camp. It was a refuge. 3 figures emerged. A tall, scarred man, a wiry youth, and an elder woman with eyes like molten amber. They held knives, stance ready, but not reckless. Jonas raised both hands. "I'm being hunted," he said, voice rasping. "I only need water, then I'll go." The elder woman, small but fierce, studied him with a gaze that pierced deeper than any overseer's glare ever had. "You're the one from yesterday," she murmured. "The big man who saved the governor." Jonas nodded. The scarred man lowered his blade slightly. "Followed by dogs," he said. "We heard." Jonas drank from the clay pot they offered, water cooling the fire in his chest. He explained nothing more. Didn't need to. The swamp had ways of spreading news. After a moment of tense silence, the elder woman, Mother Asha, spoke. "You can rest here for minutes, not hours. Governor Vale hunts out of wounded pride. He'll burn this whole marsh to ash if it means killing you." Jonas looked toward the haze of smoke creeping across the horizon. "Then I shouldn't stay." But Mother Asha's eyes remained fixed on him, studying something beyond his muscles and exhaustion. "Your running will not end this," she said softly. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Jonas left the camp with their final gift, knowledge of a concealed path leading deeper into the swamp, and moved on. Within minutes, gunshots cracked across the water. The hunters were close. He dove into the hollow trunk of a fallen cypress, covering the entrance with moss. Riders passed so near he could hear their horses snort and smell the sweat on their shirts. Vale's voice carried above the chaos. "Fan out! Burn everything he can hide in!" Jonas waited until silence returned before crawling out. Something inside him had shifted while pressed against the damp wood. Something cold, decisive. He could not outrun this forever. He had to think like the land, like the swamp creatures that survived through cunning rather than force. So he began laying traps. He disturbed foliage to create misleading footprints. He hid quicksand patches beneath tidy layers of moss. He created false trails that would splinter the search party. And the deeper he worked, the more the swamp felt like an ally rather than an obstacle. But then he found something that halted him entirely, a small shed hidden behind walls of foliage, weathered but locked. Jonas broke the padlock with a stone and stepped into the dim interior. What he found inside made his blood turn cold. Crates filled with documents, bills of sale, freedom papers stolen from legally free people, lists of names and ages, notes scribbled in the margins. Vale's signature appeared again and again, smug and looping, the mark of a man stealing human lives with ink as easily as he ordered whippings. Jonas recognized names whispered in fear over the years, men taken from docks, women seized on their way to market, children who vanished without explanation. At the bottom of one crate lay a bundle of silver lockets identical to the one Evelyn had given him. He opened one. Inside was a slip of paper marked with initials and dates, records of the governor's victims. His heart pounded violently. Evelyn had not given him a trinket. She had given him a clue, a bridge to uncovering the truth. Jonas gathered the most damning documents, tucking them into his shirt, feeling their weight as if he carried the voices of every stolen life. The swamp hunt was no longer only about survival. It had become something far bigger, exposing Vale, ending his power, breaking a system that thrived on stolen breath. Jonas left the shed with the papers pressed to his chest, and for the first time, he wasn't running. He was planning. Jonas moved through the swamp with a new purpose burning beneath his ribs. He was no longer just a hunted man. He carried evidence that could topple a governor. He navigated through narrow waterways, slipping between cypress knees and palmetto fans until he reached the area where Mother Asher and her companions had taken shelter. The sky had dimmed into a bruised twilight, and the swamp buzzed with the chorus of evening insects. Jonas gave the soft signal whistle Mother Asher had taught him, and after a moment, 2 short notes answered. When he stepped into the clearing, Mother Asher was already waiting by the fire pit, her posture straight despite her age. Caleb and Kofi stood watch at the perimeter, wary but relieved to see Jonas return. He laid the documents out in the firelight, explaining everything he had seen: the forged transfers, the stolen free papers, the lockets marked with victims' initials. The more he spoke, the darker Caleb's expression grew. Mother Asher touched one of the documents with trembling fingers. "This is the proof white men say we never have," she whispered. "Proof of what we've always known. Proof that can break a man like Vale." Jonas nodded, though fear threaded through his chest. Evidence meant nothing if he died before delivering it. They gathered closer to the fire, as Jonas described his plan: confront Vale directly, force him to negotiate in front of witnesses, leverage the documents to demand freedom for others. Kofi frowned sharply. "You're asking a cornered snake to show mercy," he said. "He'll kill you before he bargains." Caleb agreed. "This plan depends on Vale valuing his reputation more than his pride. That man's pride is carved from stone." Jonas knew they were right, but he also knew running forever would doom not just him, but every runaway hiding in the swamp. Vale's rage had already set parts of the marsh on fire. Innocent people would burn because of him. "If I die," Jonas said, "then one of you must carry these papers out. Give them to someone who can expose him, someone with power." Mother Asher's gaze sharpened. "His wife," she whispered. "Evelyn Vale. She is not blind. She leaves traces. She fears her husband's sins will bury her too. She may be the only one with enough reach to use this." Jonas considered this. Evelyn had already shown him unexpected compassion. But would she risk her life to bring down her husband? Jonas didn't know, but she had given him the locket for a reason. It was a thread of trust he could not ignore. As night deepened, they prepared. Caleb and Kofi collected stakes, vines, and anything that might serve as barriers or warnings. Mother Asher taught Jonas how to position himself on the high limestone ridge where the confrontation would happen. The ridge offered clear visibility and the faintest semblance of safety. If Vale's men approached with rifles raised, Jonas would see it. If they tried to circle around, he could retreat into the undergrowth. They rehearsed his speech, not with flowery language, but with precision. Mother Asher insisted on clarity. "Speak so even a man blinded by his own lies can't pretend he misunderstood." Jonas repeated the words until they settled into his muscles. For the first time, he saw a path not only to survival, but to something resembling justice. When the signal fire was ready to be lit at dawn, they sat around their small campfire, shadows dancing across their tired faces. Jonas remained awake long after the others drifted to sleep, staring at the dark shape of the ridge in the distance. Tomorrow would be a turning point, for him, for the swamp, for everyone Vale had ever wronged. He clasped the locket beneath his shirt, drawing strength from its cool surface. "Let morning come," he whispered to himself. "I'll meet it standing." Pre-dawn mist curled through the swamp like wandering spirits as Jonas, Mother Asher, Caleb, and Kofi moved together toward the clearing. No one spoke. Their silence felt sacred, as if sound itself would unravel the fragile resolve binding them. Birds stirred in the canopy above, rustling in restless anticipation. They reached the clearing just as the sky began to brighten with the first pale streaks of morning. Jonas ascended the limestone ridge, his injured ankle aching but steady. From up there, the burned clearing stretched before him, a wide scar in the earth where Vale's men had already committed their cruelty. Mother Asher touched Jonas's forearm. "Whatever happens, you have changed the story of this place," she said. Caleb nodded grimly. "We'll be nearby. You won't face them entirely alone." Kofi hesitated before adding, "If it becomes impossible, we'll do what we can to scatter them." Jonas offered a faint smile. "Don't risk yourselves more than you must." Mother Asher stepped back into the forest, and Caleb followed. Kofi lingered a heartbeat more, then disappeared into the foliage. Jonas took his position on the ridge. Behind him, a thin plume of smoke began to rise. The signal had been set. Jonas lay on the rough wooden floor of the shed where they had thrown him, wrists cuffed, throat dry, ankle throbbing with each heartbeat. A single crack of sunlight leaked through the boards, cutting a pale line across the dirt. Outside, the plantation moved with its usual rhythms, hammering at the forge, quiet conversation near the washing area, but none of those sounds brought comfort. Jonas felt the truth settle heavily inside him. Without the documents, he had nothing left to bargain with, and Vale's men needed no reason to hang him. Hours crawled past in suffocating heat. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Dizziness tugged at the corners of his vision. Then voices drifted through the wall. Two men speaking in urgent tones. "Political nightmare," one whispered. "If the governor doesn't wake, this whole place will be swarmed by federal inspectors." The second voice murmured back, "They say the big one in the shed killed him." Jonas closed his eyes. Lies were already blooming like weeds, twisting the truth into something deadly. But then, he's alive. Comatose, but alive. Jonas's breath caught. Vale lived. And as long as he breathed, there remained the faintest chance to turn everything around. The shed door opened hours later, and Evelyn Vale stepped inside, cloaked in traveling garments and carrying a lantern that illuminated her steady, determined expression. Jonas struggled to sit upright. She knelt beside him without hesitation, offering a tin cup of water. "Drink," she whispered. Jonas obeyed slowly, relief rolling through his body as the water eased his parched throat. "They say I killed him," Jonas murmured. Evelyn shook her head sharply. "And they're wrong. His heart failed him, not you." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a leather folder. Jonas's breath hitched when he saw what was inside, duplicates of the documents he had found in the swamp, crisp and preserved. "I've been keeping copies of everything for years," Evelyn said softly. "My husband thought himself untouchable, but I knew someday his cruelty would need to be exposed. You are not the first victim, Jonas, but you may be the one who finally stops him." Her voice trembled with conviction. She explained the plan. Jonas would be taken under the guise of medical transport to New Orleans, escorted by a trusted driver. From there, federal inspectors would take him north to safety, along with the evidence that could dismantle Vale's network. "Tonight," she said, "we move." Midnight arrived muffled and breathless, clouds swallowing the moonlight. Evelyn unlocked the shed and motioned for Jonas to follow. They crossed the yard quietly, staying within shadows. A covered wagon waited near the barn, horses pawing the ground impatiently. The driver, Silas, a stable hand Jonas recognized, gave a subtle nod. Evelyn handed Jonas sealed papers bearing the doctor's forged orders for transport. Then she lifted a second packet, her voice low and resolute. "Inside this are the documents, names of federal contacts, and a letter explaining everything. Deliver it to Inspector Marcus Webb in Baton Rouge. He is honest. He cannot be bought." Jonas took the packet, feeling the weight of dozens of stolen lives settle into his palms. "Why help me?" he finally asked. Evelyn exhaled, the lantern casting a halo around her face. "Because I stood by too long. Because I benefited from a world built on suffering. Because saving one life does not erase that. But it's a start." She pressed the silver locket into Jonas's hand once more. "Take this. Let it remind you that not everyone in power chooses silence." Before he could speak, she covered the wagon's back flap. Silas cracked the reins, and the wagon rolled into the night. They traveled toward the river town under cover of darkness, the wheels humming softly against the packed earth. Jonas lay still among blankets and false medical supplies, the packet clenched to his chest. Dawn broke gently as they reached the Mississippi, its muddy expanse glowing gold beneath the rising sun. Silas guided Jonas to a warehouse where two federal men waited, Deputy Marshal Reed and Inspector Webb himself. The inspectors wasted no time. "Mrs. Vale said you'd come," Webb said, his tone brisk but respectful. Jonas was escorted onto a small steamer flying federal colors. For the first time in his life, he walked aboard as someone whose voice mattered. Below deck, Webb reviewed the documents with growing gravity while Jonas recounted everything, from the hunts to the shed to Vale's crimes. Hours passed as the boat pressed northward. Jonas watched the shoreline drift by through the small window, each mile carrying him further from the plantation where he had almost died. When they docked in a free territory settlement weeks later, Webb placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "You've done more than save yourself," he said. "You've changed the course of many lives." Life in the free settlement was unlike anything Jonas had ever known. Families lived without fear of overseers. Children laughed openly. People walked the streets with dignity rather than dread. A carpenter named Samuel Price took Jonas into his home, offering a bed and steady work. Jonas learned the rhythm of freedom slowly, always aware that others were still fighting for the same chance. He spent his days splitting firewood, guiding new arrivals to safety, and helping those recently rescued from trafficking rings. News traveled north. Vale had survived, but his political career was collapsing under federal investigation. Several of his associates were arrested or fled the state. Evelyn Vale had returned to Boston, her testimony and documents triggering a full inquiry into trafficking networks across the river parishes. One morning, Jonas stood by the Mississippi watching the sunlight ripple across the current. He touched the silver locket through his shirt. It no longer felt like a symbol of fear or false hope. It felt like a promise that one act of mercy could lead to justice, a promise that courage, even when unwitnessed, echoes far beyond the swamp where it was born. Jonas breathed deeply, feeling the weight of his past loosen. He was no longer prey, no longer property, no longer a hunted man. He was a guide now, a protector, a witness, a survivor. And as he turned toward the settlement, ready to help the next newcomer find their footing, he carried the quiet certainty that freedom was not a finish line. It was a beginning.